It was a calm afternoon, and Officer Mark Reynolds was driving through the quiet streets of the city. He had been a police officer for over 10 years and knew the job well. He believed in following the rules and making sure others did too. But sometimes his patience ran thin, especially when people didn't listen to him quickly enough. As he cruised down the road, he noticed an old blue car ahead of him. The vehicle was moving a little slower than the rest of the traffic, and when it reached a stop sign, it stayed there a few seconds longer than usual. Officer Reynolds frowned. He turned on his lights and pulled the car over to the side of the road. Inside the car sat an elderly woman. Her hair was gray, and her hands trembled slightly as she rolled down the window. She looked calm but tired, as if she had been through a long day. "Good afternoon, officer," she said politely, her voice soft but steady. "License and registration," Reynolds said firmly, without returning her greeting. The woman nodded and reached for her purse. Her hands moved slowly, and she struggled to find her wallet. Reynolds tapped his fingers on his belt, growing impatient. "Ma'am, I don't have all day," he said, his tone sharper now. "I understand, officer. I just need a moment," she replied, still searching. Reynolds let out a sigh. He had pulled over plenty of drivers before, but something about the way she moved frustrated him. It was too slow, too careful. He was used to people hurrying when a police officer spoke to them. "Hurry up," he said, his voice growing more annoyed. The woman looked up, surprised by his tone, but she didn't say anything. Finally, she found her wallet and pulled out her license. Her hands shook slightly as she handed it over. Reynolds took it and glanced at the name. Evelyn Carter. He didn't recognize it, and to him, she was just another driver who had made a mistake on the road. "Registration?" he asked, looking back at her. She nodded and slowly reached toward the glove compartment. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. Just as she was about to open it, Reynolds' patience snapped. "Ma'am, I need you to move faster," he said, raising his voice. "I'm trying, officer," she said calmly, though there was now a hint of nervousness in her voice. To Reynolds, it felt like she was ignoring his authority. He had seen people pretend to be innocent before, and sometimes they were hiding something. He stepped closer, watching her every move. Evelyn finally got the glove compartment open and took out the registration papers. As she turned back to him, the papers slipped from her hands and fell onto the passenger seat. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, reaching to pick them up. But Reynolds was already frustrated. To him, this was taking too long. He assumed she was stalling on purpose. Without thinking, he yanked open the car door. Evelyn gasped, startled. She hadn't expected that. "Officer, please, step out of the car," Reynolds ordered. She looked confused. "Why?" "Now," he interrupted. Evelyn took a deep breath and moved to unbuckle her seatbelt. She was moving as quickly as she could, but her hands weren't as fast as they used to be. Reynolds misread the situation. He thought she was resisting. And then, in a moment he would regret forever, he lost control of his temper. The street was quiet, but a few people nearby had started paying attention. A man across the road had his phone out, recording. Evelyn gasped again, shocked, as she put her hand to her face. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The world seemed to stop for a second. The people watching couldn't believe it either. Murmurs spread through the small crowd forming on the sidewalk. Reynolds felt a sudden rush of regret, but he quickly pushed it away. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. She wasn't following his orders fast enough, and he was just doing his job. But deep down, something felt off. Then someone in the crowd said, loud enough for him to hear, "She's somebody's mother, man." Reynolds hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Evelyn, who was still holding her face in shock, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. That's when a young woman in the crowd said something that made his stomach drop. "You better hope you know who you just put your hands on." For the first time, Officer Reynolds felt something he rarely did. Fear. Evelyn Carter sat in the back of an ambulance, holding an ice pack to her face. Her hands were still shaking, but she kept her expression calm. She had lived a long life and had seen many things, but never had she expected something like this to happen to her. The paramedics checked her wrist, gently wrapping it after noticing the swelling. "You should get this x-rayed, Mom," one of them said. Evelyn nodded. "I will." But her mind wasn't on the pain. It was on what had just happened and how quickly everything had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Reynolds stood near his patrol car, arms crossed, feeling uneasy. The situation was not playing out the way he had expected. He had thought it was a simple stop, just another part of his shift. But now, people were talking. Some were angry. Others were staring at him like he had done something unforgivable. Then he noticed something that made his chest tighten. People had their phones out. Some had been recording from the moment he pulled Evelyn over. Others had started when they heard raised voices. And now, the videos were spreading. A young man in a red hoodie walked past him, shaking his head. "You messed up, man," he muttered. "You really messed up." Reynolds ignored him and turned to one of the other officers who had arrived at the scene. "Can we get people to back away? This is getting out of hand," he said, trying to sound in control. The officer hesitated. "They're not breaking any laws, and honestly, this doesn't look good." Reynolds didn't respond. He already knew that. A few blocks away, a college student named Jake sat in a coffee shop, scrolling through his phone. He had just finished his afternoon class when he saw the video pop up on his screen. The caption caught his attention. "Elderly woman assaulted by cop. Unbelievable." Curious, he tapped the video. As it played, his eyes widened. He turned to his friend sitting across from him. "Dude, look at this," he said, tilting his phone. His friend leaned in. "No way. That's bad." Jake didn't waste any time. He shared the video on social media, adding his own caption. "This officer needs to be held accountable. No excuse for this." And just like that, the video started to spread even faster. Across town, in a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows, a man in a navy suit scrolled through his phone during a short break from his work. His assistant knocked on the door, stepping inside. "Sir, there's something you need to see," she said, holding up her phone. The man raised an eyebrow. He took the phone from her and pressed play. As the video loaded, his expression changed. His grip on the phone tightened slightly. The woman in the video. It was his mother. Judge Malcolm Carter had spent years building a reputation for fairness and integrity. He had dedicated his life to the law, believing that justice should be served equally for all. He had worked on high-profile cases, sat in courtrooms where history was made, and fought to ensure the legal system worked the way it was supposed to. And now, right in front of him, was a video of his own mother being treated like she was nothing. His assistant watched his face carefully. "Sir, what do you want to do?" Malcolm Carter didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then he opened them, his expression calm but firm. "Call my mother," he said. "Find out where she is. And then, call the press." The video had already reached tens of thousands of views. But when people realized who the woman in the video was, everything changed. Within hours, the story exploded. News stations picked it up. Headlines appeared on major websites. Judge's mother attacked during traffic stop. Officer under investigation. People were furious. The police department started getting calls from reporters, demanding a response. The mayor's office received emails from concerned citizens. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs and chanting. And Officer Reynolds. He sat alone in a small office, scrolling through his own phone, watching as his name became known for all the wrong reasons. His face was all over the news. His badge number was being shared online. Panic started to set in. This was not just another traffic stop anymore. Officer Mark Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at his phone screen. His name was everywhere. News articles, social media posts, videos. It was all about him. Every few seconds, a new comment popped up under the video that had now gone viral. This officer needs to be fired immediately. How can someone do this to an elderly woman? She's the mother of a judge. He's in big trouble now. His hands felt sweaty as he scrolled through the messages. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but nothing like this. The whole city seemed to be watching. His phone buzzed with a call, and when he saw the name on the screen, his stomach tightened. Chief Howard. He took a deep breath and answered. "Sir." "What the hell did you do, Reynolds?" The chief's voice came through, sharp and angry. "Do you have any idea who that woman is?" Reynolds swallowed hard. I didn't know, sir. I thought she was resisting." The chief let out a long breath. "You thought an old woman was resisting?" His voice was laced with disbelief. "Do you know who her son is?" Reynolds didn't answer. He already knew now. Everyone did. Judge Malcolm Carter. One of the most respected federal judges in the country. A man known for his firm stance on justice and fairness. A man with strong connections to powerful people. And Reynolds had just put his hands on his mother. The chief's voice dropped lower, but it was no less intense. "Listen carefully. This is bigger than you now. We're getting calls from the mayor's office. Reporters are outside the station. The department is under fire, and it's all because of you." Reynolds felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "What do I do, sir?" There was a pause. Then the chief said, "For now, you're on administrative leave. Hand in your badge and gun." Reynolds gripped the phone tighter. "Sir, Now, Reynolds," the chief snapped, "and don't talk to the press. Not a word." The call ended, leaving Reynolds sitting in stunned silence. He had thought this would all blow over. He had thought he could explain himself. But now it was clear this wasn't going away. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Malcolm Carter stood outside the hospital, his phone pressed to his ear. His mother was inside, being checked by doctors. She had told him she was fine, that she didn't want him to worry. But how could he not? His assistant was on the line, updating him. The news stations are all covering it now. People are calling for the officer's arrest. Some groups are already planning protests outside the police department. Malcolm's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about something bigger. He turned and looked through the hospital window. His mother was sitting on the bed, talking softly to a nurse. Even now, she looked calm. She had always been strong, always believed in kindness and patience. But Malcolm wasn't feeling patient. "Set up a press conference," he said. "I'm making a statement." Later that evening, news cameras flashed as Malcolm Carter stood before a crowd of reporters. His face was serious, his voice steady. "My mother, Evelyn Carter, was assaulted by a police officer during a routine traffic stop," he said, looking directly at the cameras. "This is unacceptable, not just because she is my mother, but because no one should have to experience this." People watching from home nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about one officer," Malcolm continued. "It's about a system that allows things like this to happen. It's about accountability. And I promise you, justice will be served." His words spread across television screens and social media. People cheered. Others grew angrier. Back at the police department, Reynolds sat in his car, watching the press conference on his phone. His face grew pale as he listened to Malcolm Carter's words. He had been in tough situations before. But this was a storm he wasn't sure he could escape. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his car outside the police station, gripping the steering wheel. His mind was racing. Just days ago, he was just another cop, doing his job, following the routine. Now his name was all over the news. His face was being shared online. People were calling him dangerous, unfit to wear the badge. He took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A group of reporters stood near the doors, microphones in hand, cameras pointed right at him. The moment they spotted him, They rushed forward. "Officer Reynolds, do you have anything to say about the incident?" One reporter called out. "Do you regret your actions?" Another asked. "Have you spoken to Judge Carter?" The questions came at him fast, but Reynolds kept walking, ignoring them. He had been warned. Don't talk to the press. Right now, anything he said could make things worse. As soon as he stepped inside, the station felt different. Officers who usually greeted him barely made eye contact. Some whispered to each other when he passed. He wasn't just another cop anymore. He was the cop everyone was talking about. He walked straight to the chief's office. Chief Howard sat behind his desk, his expression tense. He gestured for Reynolds to sit. "You know why you're here," the chief said. Reynolds nodded, his mouth dry. "I won't sugarcoat it," the chief continued. "This situation is bad. The department is under pressure. The mayor wants answers. The people want action. And to be honest, Reynolds, I can't protect you from this." Reynolds shifted in his seat. "Sir, I was just doing my job." I thought she was resisting. The chief sighed and leaned forward. "Look, we both know this doesn't look good. The video is everywhere. People don't care what you thought. They care about what they saw. An elderly woman, someone's mother, being treated like a threat." Reynolds swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "For now, you're officially suspended," the chief said. "Without pay. Internal Affairs is investigating, and depending on their findings, you could be fired." He paused before adding, "or worse." Reynolds' heart pounded. "Worse." The chief met his eyes. "The DA is looking into possible charges. If they decide to press charges, you could be facing legal trouble." Reynolds felt like the floor had been pulled from under him. He had never imagined something like this happening. He had been on the force for years. He had seen other officers get complaints, some even get suspended. But this— "Sir, this is my career," Reynolds said, his voice quieter now. The chief sighed again. "I know. But right now, we have to think about the department. This case is too big. The public wants accountability." Reynolds knew what that meant. They needed someone to take the fall. He stood up, his mind spinning. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. As he made his way toward the exit, he felt the weight of the stairs around him. Some officers whispered. Others just looked away. For the first time in his career, he felt like he didn't belong here. Outside, the protest had grown larger. People stood holding signs, chanting for justice. Some had pictures of Evelyn Carter. Others had messages demanding police reform. The energy in the air was tense, but determined. Judge Malcolm Carter stood near the crowd, watching everything unfold. He had spent years fighting for justice inside the courtroom, but now this fight was personal. A reporter approached him. "Judge Carter, do you believe the officer should be arrested?" Malcolm took a deep breath. "I believe that no one should be above the law. If a citizen had done what that officer did, they would face consequences. The same rules should apply to law enforcement." The reporter nodded. "And what do you say to those who believe this was just a mistake?" Malcolm's eyes hardened. "A mistake. A mistake is forgetting someone's name. A mistake is misplacing your keys. This was a choice to treat someone without respect, a choice that had consequences. And now, there must be accountability." The crowd around him cheered. The pressure on the police department grew stronger. And in that moment, Officer Mark Reynolds knew his life would never be the same again. Morning arrived, but Mark Reynolds barely slept. His mind had been racing all night, thinking about what the Internal Affairs detectives had said. Now, as he sat in his car outside the police station, he could feel the weight of his situation pressing down on him. The protests outside had grown even larger. People held signs that read "Justice for Evelyn," and "No one is above the law." Reporters stood near the entrance, their cameras ready. Mark clenched the steering wheel. He had never imagined his career would come to this. He had wanted to serve and protect, but now he was the one people wanted protection from. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Scott Harris. "Mark, where are you?" Scott's voice was calm but firm. "I'm outside the station," Mark replied. "Listen, the district attorney is making a public statement in an hour. Word is, they're moving forward with charges." Mark's heart dropped. "What charges?" "Officially, they'll announce it soon, but from what I've heard, they're considering excessive force and misconduct." Mark closed his eyes. He had hoped this would all go away, but now it was clear it wasn't going to. "You need to be prepared," Scott continued. "They'll probably ask you to turn yourself in. The best thing you can do is cooperate." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. "And what if I don't?" Scott sighed. "Then they'll issue a warrant, and things will get even worse." Mark hung up without another word. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the sky. His whole life, he had followed orders. He had believed in the system. But now he was the one facing judgment. Across town, Judge Malcolm Carter stood in a packed courtroom, waiting for the district attorney to speak. News cameras were set up, capturing every moment. The room was filled with reporters, legal experts, and community leaders. Finally, District Attorney Linda Morrison stepped forward. She was a tall woman with a firm expression, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "After reviewing all available evidence, including video footage and witness statements, our office has decided to charge Officer Mark Reynolds with excessive force and official misconduct," she announced. The room filled with whispers. The reporters quickly typed notes and sent updates. Malcolm Carter remained silent, but inside, he felt a sense of relief. Justice was moving forward. The DA continued. "Law enforcement officers have a duty to serve with fairness and respect. No one is above the law. Today, we take a step toward accountability." Outside the courthouse, the news spread fast. Protesters cheered. Social media exploded with reactions. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Howard sat in his office, rubbing his temples. He had just gotten off the phone with the mayor, who had made it clear the city wanted action. A knock at the door made him look up. Mark Reynolds stood there, his face pale. "Sir, I'm here to turn myself in." The chief sighed. He had seen many officers come and go, but this situation was unlike anything before. "Come in," he said. Mark stepped inside, his shoulders tense. "You understand what's happening?" the chief asked. Mark nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good," the chief said. "Then let's do this the right way." A few minutes later, Mark Reynolds walked out of the station in handcuffs. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The crowd outside erupted with mixed reactions. Some cheered. Some watched in silence. Judge Malcolm Carter, watching from his office, took a deep breath. His mother had told him not to let anger guide him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Mark Reynolds sat in a small holding cell, staring at the plain walls. The cold metal bench beneath him felt harder than any chair he had ever sat in. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. He never thought he would end up here. Just days ago, he was a police officer, walking these same halls with confidence. Now, he was waiting to be processed like a criminal. His badge, his gun, his uniform, everything had been taken away. A guard appeared at the bars. "Reynolds, your lawyer is here." Mark stood up and followed the guard down the hall. When they entered the small meeting room, his lawyer, Scott Harris, was already seated, flipping through a thick file of papers. Scott looked up. "Mark, we have a lot to talk about." Mark sat across from him. "What's the plan?" Scott leaned forward. "The DA is serious about these charges. They're not backing down. The evidence against you is strong, and the public pressure is only making things worse. But we still have options." Mark rubbed his temples. "Like what?" Scott exhaled. "We can fight this in court, but that's risky. If you're convicted, you could face jail time." Mark swallowed hard. The idea of going to prison sent a chill down his spine. Scott continued. The DA might offer a deal, plead guilty to lesser charges, avoid jail, and maybe do community service instead. But that's not guaranteed. Mark shook his head. I'm not a criminal. I was just doing my job. Scott's eyes narrowed. Mark, this isn't about what you think. It's about what the court sees. And right now, the court sees a man who used force on an elderly woman. You need to understand how serious this is. Mark clenched his fists. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But deep down, he knew Scott was right. Before he could respond, the door opened and a guard stepped in. Your bail hearing is in an hour. Scott nodded. All right, Mark. Let's get through this first. Meanwhile, Judge Malcolm Carter sat at his desk, staring at the stack of legal documents in front of him. The past few days had been exhausting. His mother, Evelyn Carter, was slowly recovering, but she still had to use a brace on her wrist. Malcolm had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, but this case was different. This time, it was personal. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the DA's office. Reynolds' bail hearing is scheduled. We expect protests outside the courthouse. Security will be tight. Malcolm sighed. The city was on edge, and tensions were rising. Some people believed Reynolds deserved the harshest punishment possible. Others argued that he was being treated unfairly because of public pressure. One thing was certain. This case had become bigger than just one officer. It was now a symbol of something much larger. At the courthouse, reporters gathered outside, their cameras pointed at the entrance. Protesters held signs, chanting for justice. Police officers stood nearby, keeping an eye on the growing crowd. Inside, Mark Reynolds was led into the courtroom, his hands cuffed in front of him. He avoided eye contact with the people sitting in the audience. He could feel their stares, their judgment. Judge Carter sat at the bench, his expression unreadable. He was not handling the case directly, but his presence in the room sent a clear message. He was watching closely. The bail hearing began. The prosecutor stood first. Your Honor, we request that bail be denied. The defendant's actions have caused public outrage, and there are concerns about community safety. We believe he should remain in custody until trial. Scott stood next. Your Honor, my client is not a flight risk. He has served in law enforcement for years. He has a family, a home. He is willing to cooperate fully. We ask for reasonable bail. The judge listened carefully. The courtroom was silent as he made his decision. After a moment, he spoke. Bail is set at $50,000. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Some people felt it was too low. Others thought it was fair. Scott turned to Mark. We'll get you out soon. Mark nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Even if he was released, this wasn't over. His trial was coming. And with it, the biggest fight of his life. Outside the courthouse, Malcolm Carter stepped into the fresh air. He looked at the crowd, the people demanding justice for his mother. One reporter rushed up to him. Judge Carter, do you think Reynolds will be convicted? Malcolm paused. That's for the court to decide. But I believe in the law, and I believe justice will be served. As he walked away, he knew one thing for sure. This case wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about accountability, about fairness, about change. And the whole country was watching. Mark Reynolds sat at the defense table, his hands resting on his lap. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken. Reporters, community leaders, police officers, and ordinary citizens all watched as the trial began. The air was tense, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The trial had officially begun. The prosecutor stood first. She was a sharp, confident woman with a steady voice. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. It is about a police officer who used unnecessary force on an innocent elderly woman. It is about justice. She turned and pointed to Mark. The evidence will show that the defendant, Officer Mark Reynolds, did not act out of fear or self-defense, but out of aggression, and that aggression caused harm. Mark swallowed hard. He kept his face blank, but inside, his stomach twisted. His lawyer, Scott Harris, stood next. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not a criminal. He is a man who has spent years serving his community. What happened that night was unfortunate, but it was not intentional. He did not know who she was. He made a mistake, and mistakes should not destroy a man's life." Mark kept his eyes forward, trying not to let the weight of the moment crush him. The trial moved quickly. Witness after witness took the stand. First came the bystanders who had seen what happened. "I saw her struggling, but she wasn't fighting," one man said. "She was just scared." Then came the medical expert. Evelyn Carter suffered a sprained wrist and bruising. The doctor explained. While not life-threatening, these injuries were painful and could have been avoided. Next was Malcolm Carter himself. He stood in front of the jury, his voice calm but firm. "My mother did nothing wrong that night. She was confused, not resisting, and instead of treating her with patience, Officer Reynolds treated her like a threat. That is not how justice should work." Mark shifted in his seat. He knew Malcolm's words carried weight. The jury listened carefully. Then came the hardest moment of all. Evelyn Carter was helped to the witness stand. Though her bruises had faded, her presence alone was powerful. She looked at Mark as she spoke. "I was scared that night," she said softly. "I didn't know what was happening. I've lived in this city for years. I've seen officers protect and serve. But that night, I didn't feel safe." Her voice did not shake. She was not angry, but her words cut deep. "I forgive you," she said, looking directly at Mark. "But that does not mean there should be no consequences." Mark felt his throat tighten. He had expected anger. He had expected harsh words. But forgiveness, that was harder to hear than anything else. Finally, it was Mark's turn to speak. He stood up and faced the jury. "I won't stand here and make excuses," he said. "I made a mistake. I reacted without thinking. I should have handled things differently. And for that, I am sorry." Silence filled the courtroom. He continued, his voice lower. "I became a police officer because I wanted to protect people. But that night, I failed. And I have to live with that." His lawyer had told him not to admit fault so openly. But Mark didn't care. He wasn't trying to save his job anymore. He was just trying to be honest. The jury left to make their decision. Hours passed. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom stood still as the judge read the verdict. "On the charge of excessive force, we find the defendant guilty." Gasps filled the room. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked shocked. Mark's face remained blank, but inside, his heart pounded. The judge continued. "Officer Mark Reynolds, you are sentenced to 6 months of probation, community service, and mandatory training on de-escalation tactics." The room was filled with mixed reactions. Some believed the punishment was too light. Others thought it was fair. Evelyn Carter nodded slowly. She had not wanted revenge. She had wanted change. And this was a start. After the trial, Malcolm Carter walked outside, where reporters waited. "Are you satisfied with the verdict?" one asked. Malcolm took a deep breath. Justice is a process. No one case will fix everything. But today, we took a step forward. Inside, Mark Reynolds sat alone, his head in his hands. His career in law enforcement was over. His reputation was damaged. But he had one chance, to learn, to grow, and to change. Because justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure mistakes like his didn't happen again. And for the first time in a long time, Mark knew he had a long road ahead. Mark Reynolds sat on his couch, staring at the television screen. His living room was dark, except for the glow of the news broadcast. His phone lay on the table beside him. buzzing with messages he didn't want to read. On the screen, a news anchor spoke in a serious tone. Officer Mark Reynolds, now suspended from the force, is under investigation for his actions during a traffic stop involving Evelyn Carter, the mother of Judge Malcolm Carter. Protests continue outside the police station, and sources say the district attorney is considering charges. Reynolds clenched his fists. Just a week ago, he had a steady job, a routine, a normal life. Now, everything was falling apart. His neighbors avoided him. His friends barely spoke to him. Even his own family was keeping their distance. His father had called earlier. The conversation had been short. "Mark, what were you thinking?" "Dad, I didn't know who she was." "That doesn't matter. You shouldn't have done it to anyone." Reynolds had no answer to that. He had told himself over and over that he was just doing his job. But deep down, he knew he had been too aggressive. He had let his frustration get the best of him. And now he was paying the price. A loud knock on his front door made him jump. He hesitated before standing up. When he opened the door, two men in suits stood on his porch. One of them held up a badge. "Detective Harris, Internal Affairs." The man said, "We need to talk." Reynolds stepped aside, letting them in. The detectives sat across from him at the kitchen table. Harris pulled out a notepad. "Officer Reynolds, we're conducting an official investigation into your actions. You have the right to remain silent, but we'd like to hear your side of the story." Reynolds rubbed his face. "I already told my supervisor everything." "Tell us again," Harris said. Reynolds sighed. "I pulled her over because of a broken taillight. She didn't have her ID right away, and when I asked her to step out of the car, she hesitated. I thought she was resisting, so I acted. I didn't know who she was." Harris exchanged a look with his partner. "You understand that there's video evidence, right? People say she wasn't resisting." Reynolds tensed. "She didn't listen to my orders immediately. That's enough reason to be cautious." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Cautious or aggressive?" Reynolds didn't answer. Harris leaned forward. "Mark, here's the truth. This case isn't going away. The district attorney is considering pressing charges against you. If that happens, you'll need a lawyer. And if this goes to trial, well, you saw the protests. People are angry." Reynolds' stomach twisted. "Are you saying I could go to jail?" Harris sighed. "I'm saying you should prepare for the worst." Reynolds sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had thought being suspended was the worst of it. Now he realized this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Evelyn Carter was resting in her bed. The swelling on her face had gone down, but her wrist was still wrapped in a brace. Despite everything, she remained calm. Judge Malcolm Carter sat beside her. He had spent the entire day dealing with phone calls, interviews, and meetings, but now he just wanted to be with his mother. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Evelyn smiled. "I'm fine, Malcolm. You know I've been through worse." Malcolm shook his head. "You shouldn't have to go through anything like this. Not now, not ever." Evelyn placed a hand on his. "You're doing what's right, but don't let anger guide you. Make sure justice is served the right way." Malcolm nodded, though he still felt a deep frustration inside him. He wanted to see Reynolds held accountable. He wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was his assistant. "Sir, the DA is making an announcement tomorrow morning. You'll want to be there." Malcolm took a deep breath. "I will be." As the night passed, the city held its breath, waiting for what would come next. And for Mark Reynolds, the weight of his choices had never felt heavier.